The first thread of this story begins in 1849 in a place you might never expect. Picture a young British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard, his hands trembling as he brushes centuries of dust from a collection of clay tablets buried beneath the ruins of ancient Nineveh. The year is 1849, and Layard has no idea that what he's uncovered will shake the foundations of biblical scholarship forever. These tablets, covered in wedge-shaped marks that scholars call cuneiform, would eventually find their way to the British Museum. There, in the quiet halls lined with artifacts from civilizations long dead, a brilliant Assyriologist named George Smith would spend years painstakingly deciphering their secrets. Imagine Smith hunched over his desk, oil lamp casting dancing shadows across the ancient clay. Day after day, he works to unlock the meaning of each tiny mark, each cluster of wedges pressed into clay by hands that had been dust for over 2 millennia. The work is meticulous, maddening, requiring the patience of a monk and the intuition of a poet. Then comes the moment that changes everything. Smith's eyes widen as he translates a particular sequence of symbols. His hands begin to shake as he reads the ancient Babylonian text. The words emerging from the ancient clay are impossible, yet undeniable. He's reading about the separation of heaven and earth, about the creation of light from darkness, about the formation of humanity from clay. Smith stands abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The tablet in his hands is dated to at least 1800 BCE, over 1,000 years before anyone believes Genesis was written. But these aren't Hebrew words. This isn't the Bible. This tablet is older than Moses, older than Abraham, older than any Hebrew ever born. He's discovered the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and its parallels to the book of Genesis are so precise, so detailed, that Smith reportedly became so overwhelmed, he began tearing off his clothes in excitement, running around the British Museum in a state of scholarly ecstasy. The scholars around him look up, startled. Security has to escort him from the building. Later, he'll be embarrassed by his reaction, but in that moment, he simply cannot contain what he's found. But Smith's discovery was only the beginning. As more tablets were translated, a staggering truth emerged. The creation story that billions believed was revealed directly from God to Moses bore striking, undeniable similarities to pagan myths that had been told in Mesopotamian temples for over 1,000 years before Moses was born. Both stories begin with watery chaos filling the universe. Both describe the separation of light from darkness as the first act of creation. Both place the creation of heavenly bodies before the formation of humanity. Both culminate with the fashioning of human beings as the crown of creation. The parallels weren't coincidental. They couldn't be. Something far more sophisticated was happening here, something that would require us to completely reimagine how sacred stories come to be. Imagine you're a Hebrew scribe in the 6th century BCE. Your world has ended. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple, the house of your God, has been reduced to rubble and ash. You've been marched hundreds of miles across the desert to Babylon, the greatest city in the world, where you'll spend the rest of your life in exile. But you're not locked in a dungeon. You're living in the city itself, walking its streets, and most importantly, you have access to its libraries. The libraries of Babylon are unlike anything you've ever seen. Room after room filled with clay tablets, tens of thousands of them containing the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization stretching back 2,000 years. Creation myths, flood stories, tales of gods and heroes. The entire mythological history of the world's oldest civilizations preserved in cuneiform script. You're a scholar, a theologian, and you're facing the greatest crisis of your life. How do you preserve your people's identity when everything they knew has been destroyed? How do you maintain faith in your God when he allowed his temple to burn? You begin to read the tablets, and what you discover changes everything. You find a figure called Adamu, the first man created by the god Ea, fashioned with divine wisdom, but denied immortality through a cruel trick of the gods. But Adamu wasn't alone in the mythology of the ancient world. There, in the ancient Sumerian texts, you find another figure called Adamu, created by the goddess Ninhursag from clay of the earth in a special garden. The name is so close to Adam it makes your breath catch. You sit back, stylus in hand, and you realize something profound. You can use this. You can take these ancient stories your captors already know and revere, and transform them. You can adapt them to tell your own story, to preserve your own God, to maintain your people's identity even in exile. But you'll have to be brilliant about it. Here's where the genius begins to reveal itself. The Hebrew writers didn't simply copy these stories, they transformed them. Where Mesopotamian myths portrayed humanity as slaves created to serve the gods, the Hebrew account elevated humans to the image of the divine. Where pagan stories showed gods as petty, quarrelsome, and morally ambiguous, the Hebrew narrative presented a deity of perfect justice and love. The name Adam itself carries this transformation. In Hebrew, it means mankind, or from the earth, connecting directly to the Hebrew word Adamah, meaning ground or soil. But the echo of Adamu is unmistakable, like a melody played in a different key but recognizable to anyone who knows the original song. But the deepest transformation was yet to come, buried in a story that would require the Hebrew writers to perform their most audacious act of mythological surgery. To understand it, we need to journey to a place that existed long before Eden was ever imagined, to a garden that bloomed in the minds of Mesopotamian poets thousands of years before Moses was born. Picture the ancient scribes of Sumer, their reed styluses scratching across wet clay, recording a tale that already felt old to them. They wrote of Dilmun, a paradise where gods walked among flowering trees, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with divine presence. In this sacred garden grew plants of power, trees whose fruit could grant wisdom or eternal life to any brave or foolish enough to taste them. The trees were attended primarily by priestesses, women who served as intermediaries between humanity and the divine feminine powers that controlled fertility, wisdom, and life itself. The trees weren't forbidden. They were the whole point. You came to the sacred grove specifically to seek wisdom, to commune with the divine, to access knowledge that could heal or transform you. Throughout the ancient Near East, these trees were associated with goddesses. The Asherah poles in Canaan, the sacred date palms of Mesopotamia, the cosmic trees of Norse and Hindu mythology. Always, these trees represented access to divine wisdom, often through feminine divine figures. At the heart of Dilmun stood two trees that would echo through mythology for millennia. One bore the fruit of knowledge, its branches heavy with the weight of secrets. The other was the tree of immortality, its leaves rustling with the whisper of endless life. Between them moved figures whose stories would be retold in 100 different ways, in 100 different tongues, until their original names were forgotten, but their essence remained. There was Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who knew the secret ways of both trees. There was the first man, formed from clay by divine hands, wandering through this paradise with innocent eyes. And there was the serpent, not yet the villain of later tales, but an ancient symbol of wisdom and renewal. Its ability to shed its skin, making it a creature that danced between death and rebirth. But the most crucial figure in this ancient drama was one whose transformation would require the Hebrew writers to commit an act of theological rebellion so bold that its implications still reverberate today. Her name was Nin-Hursag, and she was the great mother goddess, the lady of life, the one who breathed the first breath into humanity's clay forms. In one particular Sumerian tale, this goddess performs an act that will haunt biblical literature forever. When the god Enki falls ill from eating forbidden plants, Nin-Hursag takes one of his ribs and from it creates a healing goddess whose very name tells the secret of her power. She calls her Ninti, a word that carries two meanings in the ancient tongue, Lady of the Rib and Lady who gives life. Now imagine Hebrew scribes, centuries later, encountering this ancient story in the libraries of Babylon. Picture them recognizing the profound power of this narrative, seeing in it the raw materials for something entirely new. But they face a theological problem that would test their creativity to its limits. How do you take a story centered on a powerful goddess and reshape it for a faith that recognizes only one God? How do you preserve the emotional and mythological power of the original while serving an entirely different religious vision? Their solution was breathtaking in its audacity. They performed what amounts to a gender reassignment surgery on mythology itself. The great goddess Nin-Hursag, creator of humanity, becomes the Lord God, the sole divine craftsman. The healing goddess Ninti, born from a rib to give new life, is stripped of her divinity and transformed into Eve, a mortal woman created from Adam's rib to be his companion. The Lady of Life becomes the mother of all living, but her power is now borrowed rather than inherent, granted rather than innate. But the Hebrew writers weren't content with simple transformation. They embedded layers of meaning into their new story that would have delighted the ancient poets who first sang of Dilmun. The name they gave to their paradise, Eden, carries echoes of the Sumerian Eden, meaning plain or steppe. The rivers that flowed through their garden mirror the waterways that nourished Mesopotamian civilization. Most remarkably, they preserved the essential structure of the ancient tale while completely inverting its meaning. Where the Mesopotamian story celebrated the goddess's power to create and heal, the Hebrew version introduces themes of temptation, disobedience, and exile. Where the original tale ended with divine healing and restoration, the new story concludes with expulsion and the promise of death. Yet something of the goddess survived in this transformation, like a genetic memory embedded in the new narrative. Eve's title as the Mother of All Living echoes Nin-Hursag's role as the creator of humanity. Her creation from Adam's rib preserves the ancient motif of life emerging from bone. Even her name, Hawa in Hebrew, resonates with ancient epithets for the mother goddess found throughout the region. The transformation is breathtaking in its audacity. A goddess becomes a woman. A divine being becomes a supporting character. The Lady of the Rib becomes the woman from the rib. It's theological revolution disguised as familiar storytelling. But there was one more figure in this ancient drama whose transformation would complete the Hebrew writer's masterpiece of mythological engineering, the trickster's final act. Deep in the literature of the ancient world, long before the serpent slithered into Eden, there lived a character type that appeared in nearly every culture's storytelling tradition. The Greeks called him Hermes. The Norse knew him as Loki. The Africans told tales of Anansi the spider. Native Americans spoke of coyote and raven. They were tricksters, beings who existed in the liminal spaces between order and chaos, between the divine realm and the mortal world. They were neither wholly good nor entirely evil, but something far more complex and dangerous. They were agents of change, catalysts of transformation, beings who revealed hidden truths through deception and brought knowledge through transgression. Throughout the ancient world, serpents were sacred. In Mesopotamian mythology, the serpent carried this archetypal power. It was a creature of wisdom and cunning, associated with the god Ningish-Zida, a deity of fertility and the underworld. In Egypt, the Uraeus cobra represented divine authority and protection. In Greece, serpents were associated with Asclepius, the god of medicine. The serpent's ability to shed its skin made it a powerful symbol of renewal, transformation, and rebirth, a creature that died and returned to life in an endless cycle. Serpents didn't lie. They revealed hidden wisdom. They mediated between the underworld and the world above. They were teachers, and they were frequently associated with goddesses. There's even linguistic evidence that Eve's name in Hebrew echoes Aramaic words for serpent, suggesting a much older connection between the first woman and the wisdom-bringing snake that many scholars believe was deliberately obscured. You understand what this means. In the older traditions, Eve and the serpent might have been two aspects of the same divine feminine principle. The goddess of life and wisdom, represented both in human and serpent form. Imagine the Hebrew scribes encountering this rich tradition of serpent symbolism. They would have known the stories of Apep, the great serpent of Egyptian mythology that battled the sun god each night. They would have heard tales of the rainbow serpent in various ancient traditions, a creature that brought both blessing and destruction. They would have understood that serpents in the ancient world were far more than mere animals. They were symbols of the deepest mysteries of existence. But the Hebrew writers faced a theological challenge that would test their creative abilities to their limits. How do you incorporate the profound symbolic power of the serpent into a narrative that serves a radically different religious vision? How do you preserve the archetypal resonance while transforming the meaning? Their solution was to perform one final devastating transformation. They needed a villain. Their story required someone to blame for humanity's exile from paradise, and it cannot be their god. So they look at the serpent, and they perform the most audacious inversion yet. They took the ancient trickster serpent, this complex figure of wisdom, divine knowledge and renewal, and simplified it into something far more sinister. They kept the serpent's promise intact. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. Anyone hearing this story who is familiar with the older traditions would recognize it immediately. That's exactly what serpents offered in the sacred mysteries: divine knowledge, transformation, the chance to transcend ordinary human limitations. But in their story, that promise becomes a lie. The serpent isn't a wisdom giver anymore. It's a deceiver. The knowledge it offers isn't enlightenment, it's a curse. Instead of transformation and rebirth, it brings shame and exile and death. Yet even in this transformation, they preserved something of the original's power. The serpent in Eden still possesses knowledge that humans lack. It still serves as the catalyst for a fundamental change in human consciousness. It still occupies that liminal space between the divine and mortal realms, speaking truths that even God has not directly revealed. The conversation between the serpent and Eve reads like a philosophical dialogue, a careful exploration of knowledge, desire, and consequence. "You will not surely die," the serpent whispers. and in a sense it speaks truth. Adam and Eve do not immediately perish when they eat the forbidden fruit. Instead, they gain something precious and terrible: the knowledge of good and evil, the burden and gift of moral awareness. This transformation of the trickster figure from wise guide to tempter represents perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated element of the Hebrew writers' mythological engineering. They understood that knowledge always comes with a price, that awareness brings both power and pain. By making the serpent the agent of this transformation, they created a figure that could carry the full weight of humanity's complex relationship with wisdom itself. The serpent becomes not just the villain of the piece, but a mirror for humanity's own conflicted nature. Like the ancient tricksters it echoes, it reveals uncomfortable truths through deception, brings necessary change through transgression, and serves as a reminder that the most profound transformations often come through the most painful experiences. In the hands of later interpreters, this nuanced figure would be simplified into Satan, the ultimate enemy of good. But in the original Hebrew narrative, the serpent remains something more ambiguous and therefore more haunting. It is the shadow side of wisdom, the reminder that knowledge and innocence cannot coexist, the agent of a transformation that is both curse and gift. This wasn't simple borrowing or unconscious influence. This was deliberate, sophisticated literary engineering, the work of writers who understood exactly what they were doing. They were taking the mythological DNA of their neighbors and recoding it to serve an entirely new purpose, creating a story that would feel familiar enough to resonate, but different enough to revolutionize. The result was a narrative that would go on to shape the moral imagination of half the world. Billions of people would see in Adam and Eve the story of their own origins, their own struggles with temptation and consequence. Artists would paint their exile from Eden. Poets would explore the meaning of their fall. Theologians would debate the implications of their choices for thousands of years. The Hebrew writers had completed their masterpiece. From the raw materials of ancient mythology, they had crafted a narrative that would reshape the spiritual imagination of humanity. They had taken gods and made them mortal, transformed goddesses into women, and turned trickster wisdom bringers into agents of necessary but painful change. The story they created would travel into 1,000 languages, interpreted by countless cultures. It would inspire art and literature, comfort the suffering and challenge the comfortable, provide meaning for billions of lives across thousands of years. But it would carry within it, like DNA in every cell, the genetic memory of the stories from which it was born. The Hebrew writers had achieved a kind of immortality for these ancient tales, preserving their essential power while transforming their meaning for a new age. The ancient stories of Dilmun and Adapa, of Ninti and the wise serpents, had been reborn in a form that would outlast the civilizations that first told them. Every time someone read of Eve's creation from Adam's rib, they were witnessing the echo of Ninti, the goddess born from divine bone to heal and restore. Every time they pictured the serpent in the tree, they were glimpsing a shadow of the ancient wisdom bringer, transformed from guide to tempter, but still carrying the memory of its original role. This is the true genius of the Adam and Eve narrative. It is not simply a Hebrew invention, nor is it merely a copy of older myths. The Hebrew writers had performed what might be the greatest act of literary alchemy in human history. They had taken the lead of pagan mythology and transformed it into the gold of monotheistic narrative, creating a story that would endure long after the temples of Babylon had crumbled to dust. This is just the beginning of our story. We've witnessed the discovery of the tablets, the transformation of Adam, the the reimagining of a goddess as a woman, and the remarkable transformation of the serpent. But the Hebrew writers weren't finished with their transformation. There was one more thread to weave into their tapestry, one more ancient echo that needed to be captured and reshaped. This final piece would complete their masterwork, but it would also create the most haunting parallel in all of biblical literature. If you're still here listening, leave a like so we know you're following along, and stay with me as we step into the next part of this story, the ghost story that echoes through time. Somewhere in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets that tell a story so familiar, so precisely parallel to the biblical flood narrative, that reading them feels like experiencing the most profound déjà vu in human history. The tablets contain the epic of Atrahasis, and from the moment you begin reading, you realize you've heard this story before, even if you've never encountered these ancient texts. It's as if the biblical flood narrative is haunted by this older tale, as if Noah's story is an echo of something that was already ancient when the first Hebrew was born. Picture the scene as it was first recorded in cuneiform. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods grow weary of humanity's noise and decide to cleanse the earth with water. But one god, Enki, moved by compassion, whispers a warning to a righteous man named Atrahasis. It's a story about divine conflict, about gods who disagree with each other, about a deity who sides with humanity against his fellow immortals. The parallels begin immediately and never stop. Like Noah, Atrahasis is warned by a deity. The warning comes indirectly, spoken to a wall rather than directly to the man, preserving the secrecy of divine mercy while honoring the letter of divine decree. Like Noah, the chosen man is instructed to build a vessel of specific dimensions. Like Noah, he must gather his family, collect animals of every kind, store provisions for a journey whose end cannot be calculated. The instructions are precise, detailed, urgent. Time is running short, and the waters are coming. Then comes the deluge itself, described in language that makes the earth seem to convulse with grief. Waters pour from above and below, turning the world into a chaos of destruction. Mountains disappear beneath the waves. Cities vanish without trace. All life is erased except for those sheltered within the wooden sanctuary that rides the endless sea. But the haunting doesn't stop there. When the waters finally begin to recede, both Atrahasis and Noah send out birds to test the world's readiness for return. First a dove, which finds no place to rest and returns. Then a swallow, which also comes back to the ark. Finally, a raven, which does not return, signaling that dry land has appeared at last. The vessel comes to rest on a mountain peak. The survivors emerge to find a world washed clean, empty, waiting to be repopulated. The man builds an altar and offers sacrifice, and the sweet smoke rises to heaven, pleasing to the gods who smell the offering and remember their covenant with humanity. Every detail, every beat of this ancient story would find its way into the Hebrew flood narrative with such precision that scholars reading the Mesopotamian tablets for the first time felt a chill of recognition run down their spines. It was as if they were reading the original manuscript from which the biblical account had been copied. Yet these tablets predated Moses by over 1,000 years. Now picture the Hebrew scribes encountering this story during their exile in Babylon. They would have recognized it immediately, not as a foreign tale, but as something that resonated in their very bones. The flood story wasn't just Mesopotamian mythology to them. It was the raw material from which they would craft something entirely new. But the Hebrew writers, master craftsmen that they were, didn't simply transplant this story into their scripture unchanged. They performed their characteristic transformation, taking the mythological skeleton of the Atrahasis epic and clothing it with entirely new flesh and meaning. You see, as a Hebrew scribe, the story about divine conflict, about gods who disagree with each other, won't work for you. Your entire theological project depends on establishing that there is only one God, one will, one divine authority. So you adapt it. You keep the structure identical, the warning, the boat built to specific dimensions, the animals, the birds. You keep the details so precise that anyone familiar with the Mesopotamian version will immediately recognize where your story comes from. But you change the why. In your version, the flood isn't about noise or divine inconvenience. It's about wickedness, about moral corruption so severe that your God has no choice but to cleanse the earth, and there's no divine conflict, just one righteous man chosen by one God, obeying divine commands. Same story, completely different theology. Where the Mesopotamian gods destroyed humanity out of petty annoyance at their noise, the Hebrew account attributed the flood to moral corruption, making divine judgment a response to ethical failure rather than divine irritation. Where Atrahasis was saved by divine favoritism of one God among many, Noah was preserved because of his righteousness, making survival a matter of character rather than chance. Where the pagan flood was arbitrary and capricious, the biblical deluge became an act of justice tempered by mercy. Consider the genius of what they accomplished with the character of Noah. The animals entering the ark 2 by 2, the raven and the dove, the sacrifice on the mountain, the rainbow covenant. All of these elements carried forward the emotional and symbolic power of the original while serving an entirely new theological framework. The transformation was surgical in its precision. Every element that served their theological vision was preserved and enhanced. Every detail that conflicted with monotheistic faith was carefully excised or reinterpreted. The result was a story that felt both ancient and new, familiar yet revolutionary. This is the power of mythological transformation. What the Hebrew writers had accomplished was nothing less than the creation of a new form of story, one that could carry the emotional and psychological power of the world's oldest myths while serving an entirely different religious purpose. To truly understand the magnitude of what the Hebrew writers accomplished, we have to revisit the world in which they worked. Babylon, during the exile, surrounded by the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Tablets containing thousands of years of human storytelling lined the walls of temples and palaces, each one a repository of wisdom, mythology, and cultural memory. They were sophisticated explorations of the deepest questions that haunt human existence. Why do we die? Why do we suffer? What is our relationship to the divine? How did the world come to be as it is? The answers they provided had sustained entire civilizations through war, plague, invasion, and collapse. These weren't just Hebrew scribes copying foreign stories. These were sophisticated literary artists who had been raised on the narratives of their own people, who carried in their hearts the songs and stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who knew by heart the promises made to their ancestors and the laws given at Sinai. But now they found themselves in a land where different gods were worshipped, where different stories were told to explain the same fundamental mysteries that their own traditions addressed. They could have simply rejected these foreign narratives, dismissed them as the lies of false gods. Instead, they chose a far more difficult and dangerous path. They chose to engage with these stories, to wrestle with them, to discover what truth they might contain beneath their polytheistic surface. They approached the myths of their captors not as enemies to be defeated, but as raw materials to be transformed. imagine the debates that must have taken place among them. Picture the long nights spent discussing whether the story of Adamu could be reshaped to serve their understanding of human nature, whether the tale of the Great Flood could be stripped of its polytheistic elements and transformed into a testament to divine justice. Some must have argued for rejection, for maintaining the purity of their own traditions without contamination from foreign sources. Others must have seen the opportunity, the chance to create something that could speak to both Hebrew hearts and Gentile minds, something that could carry their faith into a wider world. The fact that we're reading their stories 2.5 millennia later suggests that the latter won the debate. They created narratives that were Hebrew in theology but universal in appeal, stories that could resonate with anyone who had ever wondered about their origins, their purpose, their relationship to the divine. They had discovered something that modern storytellers still struggle to understand, that the most powerful narratives aren't invented from nothing, but transformed from something that already lives deep in human consciousness. The Adam and Eve narrative has been interpreted and reinterpreted countless times, has inspired art and literature, has provided comfort and challenge to believers and skeptics alike. The flood story that emerged from this process would go on to inspire countless works of art, literature, and film. It would provide comfort to the suffering and hope to the desperate. Yet beneath all these interpretations, like a palimpsest whose original text shows through despite being overwritten, the older stories remain. Every time someone reads about the creation of humanity from dust, they're witnessing the echo of Adamu and Adamu. Every time they picture Eve created from Adam's rib, they're glimpsing the shadow of Ninti, the goddess whose very name meant both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. Every time someone reads about Noah releasing the dove, they're seeing the shadow of Atrahasis' bird cast across thousands of years. Every time someone pictures the ark resting on Mount Ararat, they're glimpsing the echo of a much older vessel settling on a different mountain in a story that predates Moses by centuries. The proof of their success lies not just in the endurance of their stories, but in their power to continue speaking to new generations, new cultures, new questions. The result was a collection of narratives that would outlive empires and reshape the spiritual landscape of humanity forever. From Adamu to Adam, from Ninti to Eve, from Atrahasis to Noah, they performed acts of literary alchemy that turned the raw gold of pagan mythology into biblical narratives that billions would carry in their hearts. The next time you hear these ancient stories, listen carefully. Beneath the familiar words, you might just catch the whisper of even older voices, echoes of gods and goddesses whose names we've almost forgotten, but whose stories live on in ways their original tellers never could have imagined. The Hebrew scribes were master architects of a revolutionary idea. They proved that a story, when carefully edited and powerfully told, could outlive empires and reshape the spiritual DNA of humanity. But here is the profound irony of history. The very success of their unified narrative created a brand new problem centuries later. The threads of power they had so meticulously woven, the singular God, the singular sacred text, the singular path, began to unravel with the birth of Christianity. Instead of one voice, there were now dozens. This explosive spiritual diversity was not only an intellectual challenge, it was an existential threat to the men who sought to consolidate power and establish a singular church. The time had come for a new generation of architects. The ancient, ruthless process of editing history that began in the ruins of Babylon was about to begin again on an even grander, more political, and far more final scale. The story they tried to bury comes to us through the strangest of messengers, a jar hidden in the sand for 16 centuries. But before we get to that miraculous discovery, we need to understand what was at stake. You see, by the 4th century, Christianity had a problem. A beautiful, chaotic, utterly human problem. There wasn't one Christianity. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. In Alexandria, Christians read texts that spoke of Christ as a teacher of hidden wisdom. In Rome, they favored stories that emphasized his divine nature and the authority of his appointed successors. In the deserts of Egypt, monks treasured gospels that promised direct communion with the divine, bypassing any need for priestly intermediaries entirely. Imagine walking through the markets of any major city in the Roman Empire during this time. You might encounter a Christian merchant who swears by the Gospel of Thomas, with its cryptic sayings and emphasis on finding the kingdom of heaven within yourself. A few stalls over, another believer might clutch a copy of the Gospel of Philip, which speaks of sacred marriage and the divine feminine. Down a narrow alley, you could stumble upon a community reading from texts that describe Christ's childhood miracles or his secret teachings to Mary Magdalene. This wasn't heresy yet. This was simply Christianity in its raw, unedited form. Wild and diverse, and utterly uncontrollable. But wild and diverse doesn't build empires. It certainly doesn't create the kind of unified institution that Constantine needed to hold his crumbling realm together. The emperor had seen what religious unity could accomplish, and he'd also witnessed what religious division could destroy. The solution was elegant in its brutality. One empire, one faith, one book. Picture it. The year is 325 CE, and the most powerful men in the Christian world have gathered in Nicaea, not far from modern-day Istanbul. Emperor Constantine himself presides over this assembly, his purple robes a stark reminder that this is as much about politics as it is about faith. Around the marble columns and beneath painted ceilings, bishops argue with voices that echo through chambers designed for earthly power, not heavenly discourse. But here's what they don't teach you in Sunday school. This wasn't a gathering of humble servants seeking divine truth. This was damage control on an imperial scale. The council has a job: decide which texts are divinely inspired and which are heretical, which stories get preserved and which get burned. It's not a theological debate, it's a political consolidation of power. The Council of Nicaea was just the beginning. Picture those bishops, many of whom had survived the recent persecutions, now faced with a different kind of challenge. They had to decide not just what Christianity was, but what it had always been. They had to reach into the swirling chaos of competing texts and pull out a single authoritative narrative. They had to perform surgery on the body of their faith, keeping what served the emerging church's needs and discarding what didn't. The debates raged for months. Which texts were authentic? Which were inspired by God? Which were dangerous forgeries that led believers astray? But beneath these theological questions lurked more practical concerns. Which texts supported the authority of bishops? Which ones could be used to maintain order and hierarchy? Which narratives would help transform a loose collection of communities into a disciplined, centralized institution? The answer came in the form of what we now call the biblical canon. For the first time in Christian history, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria listed exactly 27 books that could be considered authentic New Testament scripture. Everything else, he declared, was forbidden, dangerous, heretical. The letter reads like a military order. These are the fountains of salvation. Let no man add to these or take away from these. But hidden between those lines was a more chilling command. Burn everything else. But here's what strikes me as remarkable. The process wasn't primarily about theological purity. It was about editorial control. These men weren't just deciding what Christians should believe, they were deciding what Christians should be allowed to remember. Think about that for a moment. In the span of a few centuries, an entire universe of Christian thought was compressed into a single, manageable collection. The rough edges were filed away, the contradictions were resolved, the inconvenient questions were eliminated. What emerged was a Christianity that could speak with one voice, march in formation, and serve the needs of an empire. For over 1,000 years, the only version of Christian origins that most people know is the version that Constantine's church decided to preserve. But what happened to all those other voices? What became of the texts that didn't make the cut? The answer is written in ash and silence. The bishops select 4 gospels and reject dozens of others. They choose texts that support hierarchical male authority and exclude texts that feature women in positions of spiritual leadership. They embrace narratives that portray Eve as the source of sin and reject texts that present her as a figure of wisdom and courage. Once the councils had spoken, once the canon was established, the real work began. Imperial edicts went out across the empire. Certain texts were now forbidden. Possessing them became a crime against both church and state. Heresy, punishable by death. Libraries that had carefully preserved these writings for centuries suddenly found themselves faced with an impossible choice: burn the books or face the consequences. The systematic destruction that followed was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Picture monks, the very people who had devoted their lives to preserving knowledge, facing an agonizing choice, forced to feed ancient manuscripts to flames. Ancient libraries, repositories of spiritual wisdom that stretched back to the earliest days of the faith, were suddenly transformed into crime scenes. Imagine scholars watching centuries of theological debate and spiritual insight reduced to smoke and cinders. The very act of possessing certain books became an offense punishable by exile or death. The irony is almost unbearable. The same institution that would later claim to be the guardian of learning was actively destroying vast portions of the written record. The efficiency of the destruction was remarkable. Within decades, texts that had been copied and shared across the Mediterranean world simply vanished. Consider what we lost in this process. The Gospel of the Hebrews, which many early church fathers had quoted and respected, disappeared entirely. The Gospel of the Egyptians, which had influenced Christian thought for centuries, survived only in fragments quoted by its critics. The Shepherd of Hermas, which had been read in churches alongside Paul's letters, was suddenly declared unfit for Christian ears. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene didn't just disappear. It was actively suppressed because it portrayed a woman as Christ's most trusted disciple, someone who understood his teachings better than Peter himself. When Peter complains in this text that Jesus loved Mary more than the male disciples, Mary's response cuts to the heart of the matter. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? That question was too dangerous to survive. The Gospel of Philip vanished because it spoke of sacred marriage as a path to spiritual enlightenment, suggesting that the union of masculine and feminine was a path to spiritual enlightenment. Feminine principles was central to understanding divine truth. The mystery of marriage is great, it declares, for without it, the world would not exist. These weren't just theological ideas. They were challenges to a church increasingly committed to celibacy and male-only priesthood. The Gospel of Thomas was perhaps the most threatening of all. Its 114 sayings attributed to Jesus emphasized direct, personal experience of the divine. The kingdom of heaven is within you and outside you, it proclaims. When you know yourselves, then you will be known. This was Christianity without churches, without priests, without the elaborate machinery of institutional salvation. You can see why such texts made church authorities profoundly uncomfortable. This wasn't just about controlling doctrine. This was surgical removal of inconvenient truths. By determining which texts could be copied, which could be read, and which could be discussed, the church was literally reshaping the past. The texts that survived were those that supported a particular vision of Christianity, one that emphasized hierarchy, obedience, and the absolute authority of the church. The texts that vanished were those that suggested alternatives: direct revelation without priestly mediation, female spiritual authority, or mystical traditions that didn't require institutional oversight. The systematic elimination of these perspectives reshaped not just Christian doctrine, but Christian imagination itself. Entire ways of thinking about the divine, about spiritual practice, about the relationship between the human and the sacred, were simply erased from the collective memory. What survived was a carefully edited version of Christianity that served the needs of an increasingly powerful and centralized institution. The parallels to our earlier story become impossible to ignore. Just as ancient Hebrew scribes had taken the chaotic pantheon of Mesopotamian mythology and reshaped it into the ordered narrative of Genesis, the early church took the chaotic diversity of Christian belief and reshaped it into the ordered narrative of Orthodox Christianity. In both cases, the process involved careful selection, deliberate omission, and the transformation of complex realities into simpler, more manageable stories. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. Because not everyone was willing to let these texts disappear forever. In 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer's shovel strikes something hard in the sand. Mohammed al-Saman wasn't looking for ancient wisdom. He was digging for fertilizer to spread on his fields. What he uncovered would shake the foundations of biblical scholarship and provide us with a window into that lost world of early Christianity. 13 leather-bound codices, buried in a large jar, hidden away sometime in the 4th century when the purges began. These weren't random texts. These were carefully selected writings that someone, somewhere, decided were too important to let die. Imagine the scene. Monks or scholars, perhaps from the nearby monastery of St. Pachomius, receiving word that imperial soldiers were on their way to confiscate and burn their library. They had hours, maybe less, to decide which texts to sacrifice and which to save. Now imagine holding one of those volumes in your hands. The leather covers are still intact, the papyrus pages yellow but readable. The Coptic script is beautiful, flowing across pages that haven't seen sunlight since the Roman Empire was young. But it's the content that takes your breath away. The monks chose to save 52 individual works, including Gospels that hadn't been read for over 15 centuries, preserved like seeds in the desert, waiting for their moment to bloom again in human consciousness. When modern scholars finally translated these documents, what emerged was a Christianity almost unrecognizable from the version that had survived. Here was the Gospel of Thomas, with its cryptic sayings that emphasized inner knowledge over external authority. Here was the Gospel of Philip, with its profound meditations on the nature of spiritual marriage. Here was the Gospel of Truth, with its poetic descriptions of divine love that transcended institutional boundaries. In these texts, Eve isn't the villain. She's the heroine. She's the one who brings wisdom to Adam, who awakens him from ignorance. The serpent isn't a deceiver. It's a liberator, revealing truth that the Creator God wanted to keep hidden. These texts preserve a completely different interpretation of the Genesis story, one that never made it into the official Bible. They show what early Christianity looked like before it was standardized, before the councils, before the burnings. And they prove that the process of editing, adapting, and suppressing didn't end with the Hebrew scribes in Babylon. Most striking of all was how these texts portrayed the relationship between the individual believer and the divine. Rather than emphasizing the need for priestly mediation or institutional authority, many of these works suggested that each person could access spiritual truth directly. They spoke of gnosis, a kind of experiential knowledge that came not from studying approved texts or following prescribed rituals, but from direct encounter with the sacred. The Gospel of Thomas puts it simply, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." These weren't just alternative scriptures. They were windows into alternative Christianity that had once flourished across the ancient world. Communities of believers who gathered not in elaborate churches, but in homes and private spaces, sharing texts that promised transformation rather than salvation, seeking unity with the divine rather than forgiveness from a distant deity. You can imagine why such ideas might have made church authorities nervous. A Christianity based on personal revelation was a Christianity that couldn't be easily controlled. A faith that promised direct access to the divine was a faith that had little need for elaborate hierarchies or institutional gatekeepers. These texts represented not just alternative theologies, but alternative structures of power. The Nag Hammadi discovery revealed the true cost of that 4th century editorial process. We could finally see what had been sacrificed in the name of unity and order. We could glimpse the rich tapestry of early Christian thought before it was reduced to a single, approved pattern. Most importantly, we could understand that the Christianity that emerged from those councils wasn't the inevitable result of organic development, but the product of deliberate choices made by people with specific agendas. This brings us back to our central theme, the power of those who control the story. The Hebrew scribes who transformed Mesopotamian mythology into Genesis were engaging in the same fundamental process as the Church Fathers who transformed diverse Christianity into Orthodox doctrine. Both groups took complex, multifaceted realities and reshaped them into narratives that served their particular purposes. The difference was scale and method. The Hebrew scribes worked primarily through creative adaptation, taking existing stories and giving them new meanings. The Church Fathers worked primarily through elimination, taking existing diversity and reducing it to approved uniformity. But in both cases, the result was the same: the creation of official versions that obscured the messy complexity of actual history. What becomes clear is that the Bible we know today is not simply a collection of ancient texts that happen to survive the centuries. It's a carefully curated anthology, shaped by specific editorial decisions made by people with specific goals. The texts that made it into the canon weren't necessarily the oldest, the most authentic, or the most spiritually profound. They were the ones that best served the needs of the emerging Christian institution. This realization doesn't diminish the spiritual value or literary power of the biblical texts. But it does remind us that these stories come to us filtered through layers of human decision-making, political maneuvering, and institutional self-interest. This brings us to the heart of what makes the Adam and Eve narrative so remarkable. The story we know in the Genesis account of Adam and Eve, with its theological sophistication and narrative brilliance, represents not just the culmination of human creativity and inspiration of ancient Hebrew writers, but also the editorial choices of later authorities who decided which version of that story would survive. The Garden of Eden carries within it the DNA of Sumerian paradise myths, Babylonian creation epics, and Egyptian wisdom traditions. But it also bears the fingerprints of every scribe who copied it, every council that approved it, every authority who decided it was worth preserving, while other stories were consigned to flames. The Church Fathers weren't just editing texts, they were editing reality itself. But think about the breathtaking scope of what they accomplished. In less than 3 centuries, they took a spiritual movement characterized by stunning diversity and compressed it into a single, manageable narrative. They transformed a collection of communities, each with its own understanding of Christ's message, into a unified institution with centralized authority and standardized beliefs. They took the chaotic beauty of early Christian thought and reshaped it into something that could serve the needs of an empire. The parallels to our earlier story become impossible to ignore. Stand back far enough, and you can see the whole structure. It begins in the libraries of Babylon, where Hebrew scribes encounter the mythological heritage of Mesopotamia and recognize both its power and its danger. They take the goddess Ninti and transform her into Eve. They take the sacred tree and make it forbidden. They take the wisdom-bringing serpent and turn it into a deceiver. They take Tiamat and reduce her to the deep. They adapt the flood narrative from the Epic of Atrahasis, keeping the details but changing the theology. They transform Adamu and Adam from divine or semi-divine figures into the first human man, created by a single God. Their work is so skilled, so psychologically sophisticated, that the adapted stories feel both familiar and revolutionary. People raised on Mesopotamian myths recognize the elements, but they're being used to advance a completely new religious vision. Then, centuries later, Christian theologians take that Hebrew foundation and build on it. They add new interpretations, new layers of meaning. They select which texts support their vision of hierarchical male authority and which preserve too much of the older goddess traditions. They burn what doesn't fit. They canonize what does. Layer upon layer of adaptation and suppression, each generation editing the stories to serve their own theological and political purposes. The story of Adam and Eve that most people know today, the one taught in churches, the one referenced in art and literature, the one that shapes how millions understand gender, authority, and the pursuit of knowledge, is the result of this multi-thousand-year process of mythological engineering. It's not ancient history. It's not primitive mythology. It's sophisticated theological architecture, built from repurposed materials, constructed over centuries by brilliant but human minds with specific agendas and political purposes. Just as the Babylonian pantheon was too complex and politically inconvenient for Hebrew monotheism, the diverse landscape of early Christianity was too complex and institutionally inconvenient for Roman Orthodoxy. The solution in both cases was the same: careful selection, deliberate omission, and the transformation of messy reality into clean narrative. The threads we've been following throughout this journey, from the temples of ancient Mesopotamia to the council chambers of imperial Rome, all lead to the same conclusion. The stories we inherit are never innocent. They're always shaped by the needs, fears, and ambitions of those who control their telling. George Smith died young, at 46, during a research expedition in Syria, but his discovery lived on. Today, in museums around the world, you can see the tablets he translated. You can read the Epic of Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, the story of Enki and Ninhursag. You can trace the linguistic connection between Tiamat and Tehom, between Ninti and Eve. You can see cylinder seals from 2300 BCE showing 2 figures seated on either side of a tree, reaching for its fruit with a serpent between them. The iconography existed 1,000 years before Genesis was written. The fingerprints are everywhere once you know where to look. They're in the names, the linguistic connections, the impossibly specific details that appear in both traditions, the systematic pattern of transformation that turns goddesses into subordinate women, sacred trees into forbidden objects, wisdom bringing serpents into demons, and in the burned texts, the suppressed gospels, the church councils that decided which stories you'd be allowed to hear. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. The story you were told was divinely revealed was actually carefully constructed by brilliant human minds working with inherited materials, adapting and transforming older traditions to serve new purposes. The question isn't whether this happened. The archaeological and linguistic evidence is clear. The question is, what do you do with this knowledge? Do you see it as a loss of faith or as insight into the extraordinary human capacity for theological innovation? Do you feel betrayed by the editing and suppression or amazed by the intellectual achievement it represents? That's not for me to answer, but I'll leave you with this. The scribes in Babylon, the bishops at Nicaea, they understood something profound about the power of stories. They knew that the narratives we tell about our origins shape everything that follows. Our understanding of authority, our relationship to knowledge, our ideas about gender and power and what it means to be human. They used that understanding to build one of the most influential mythological structures in human history. And now you know how they did it. The fingerprints are there, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, waiting in sealed jars in the Egyptian desert, preserved in the linguistic connections that scholars can no longer ignore. The truth about Adam and Eve isn't what you were told. It's so much more interesting than that. If this journey has stirred something in you, please support us with a like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Share with us the mysteries you would like us to explore next. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning. Good night.